tried to interview Vladimir Putin and the U.S. government stopped me. Think about that for a minute. Joe Biden has dementia. He's not capable of speaking a complete sentence. I guess the media hate Trump so much, or profiting in some way, I suppose, from Joe Biden being president, that they feel they have to lie about it. But they're lying, period.
Since leaving Fox and going solo with your new show, Tucker Carlson, on Twitter, now known as X, your posts have logged tens, if not hundreds of millions of views. You're taking off like Buzz Lightyear. My question is, are you feeling the freedom to explore more topics and ideas, to express your views?
Well, definitely. If anything, I've expressed my views less. I haven't done many straight-to-camera scripts where, I write the script and give my opinion. I've done what I've wanted to do for a long time but couldn't, which is get on an airplane and go see the rest of the world. And I couldn't because I had a daily show I had to do. But I've become convinced over the past several years that the world, particularly since the war in Ukraine began, that the world is changing much more quickly than most Americans understand. Mm-hmm. And because there's virtually no coverage of the rest of the world in American media, Americans don't have a good sense of it. But what we in this country refer to as the post-war order, all the institutions set up in the wake of World War II to keep the world peaceful and prosperous, and the United States at the top of the pyramid. And that would include, the dominance of the dollar, the SWIFT system, NATO, all of that appears to be crumbling to me. That's my view of it. And so I've wanted to travel and see if that is in fact happening. And it is.
Now you say you travel the world more than ever. Which personality globally fascinates you in particular?
I think right now the most interesting, wisest leader I've ever spoken to is the ruler of Abu Dhabi, MBZ.
You just come back from Abu Dhabi.
Yes, and I spoke to him, and I've interviewed a lot of people who run countries or organizations. I've interviewed a lot of leaders in 30 years. I mean, that's been my job. And I've never interviewed anybody in charge of anything more willing to admit when he doesn't understand something or know the answer to a question. I've never met a more humble leader ever. And I believe humility is a prerequisite for wisdom. Wise people admit what they don't know. And I've never seen that before. And you don't see that in the West. I mean, you're not going to interview a presidential candidate in the United States, or a president for that matter, who's willing to say, I don't know the answer. I've thought about it and I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. They'll never say that because you can't admit you don't know. And of course, the scope of human knowledge is very limited. We don't know anything, actually. We don't know how the brain works or how the pyramids were built. Mm-hmm. The list of things we don't know is far longer than the list of things we do. And no one will admit that. And the people who do, who are willing to say that out loud, are the ones that I trust. Mm-hmm. So I was very impressed. I've never been more impressed by a leader. But there are a lot of interesting people.
Mm-hmm. A brief look back. During a recent episode of your show on X, you said, quote, "The Murdochs never got in my way. They were always good to me, but they were always small-minded. It's a company run by fearful women. You know what I mean." End quote. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I spent 14 years at Fox, and, most of the time I was working in my own business. I wasn't, I had no role in managing the company, far from it. I was just an employee. So there are a lot of things about how the company runs that I wouldn't know about. But in my experience, the family that owns it, that controlled the company, the Murdochs, they were always very gentlemanly to me, very polite, nice, gave me huge latitude. I often felt, or sometimes felt, that they disagreed with what I was saying. that my views were different from theirs, but they let me express my views, and I was grateful for that. I am grateful for that. I never had a problem with them, and I don't have a problem with them now. I disagree with them on certain things, but I'll always be grateful for the chances they gave me, and the kindness they showed to me. Mm-hmm. The people who run Fox News, there are a lot of great people at Fox News, but there are also a lot of people who are just terrified, who are just trying to make it through the day. And I don't think they make Xanax strong enough for some of the people who run the place to calm down. So I meant what I said. And by the way, they're no different from, I've worked at a lot of news organizations in the United States, and they're all the same. They're all afraid of getting sued or yelled at or fired or humiliated. Interestingly, none of them are very afraid of getting things wrong. That's not a concern. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They're not worried about accuracy as much as they're worried about being unfashionable or saying something forbidden. Mm-hmm. What they're really worried about is telling the truth. You'd think if you ran a news organization, your main concern would be getting it right, and you'd be terrified that someone would make a mistake. Mm-hmm. But that's not their top concern. And not just at Fox. I mean, I worked at MSNBC and CNN. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I worked at PBS. I spent a year working at ABC. I mean, I've certainly been around a lot of news companies, and they're all the same. They're all fearful people who are making more than they probably should be, and they're worried about losing their jobs. And there's some great people too, and occasionally you'll find a courageous person, but they're very, very, very rare. Very rare.
Now you mentioned it. The media has a serious credibility problem all over, not just in the U.S. Here is same. The only national news organization in the U.S. that scores the majority of the public's trust is, according to YouGov, the Weather Channel. Half of the American public believes that the news media deliberately attempts to mislead, misinform, and propagandize. Why you've been in the news for so long. Why is the state of the media so miserable?
Well, because if you want to subvert a democracy, you need to control the information that citizens receive. So I'd argue that the news media in democracies is far less trustworthy than it is in other countries, simply because it matters more in a democracy. People vote on the basis of the information they have. So if you want to control their votes, you have to control what they know. And so there has been a very aggressive attempt over a number of decades on the part of the people who run the United States to control what's available on our news stations and in our newspapers, to control the news media.
And the people working for the news media seem to go along with it.
Of course they do, because they're terrified. I mean, they're just afraid. They go along with it. Absolutely. They're afraid to say something that will offend the people who run the government, who run the biggest companies, and most of the time they won't. And that's not just a perversion of what they should be doing. It's an inversion. I mean, they exist to hold the people in power accountable. And instead, they do exactly the opposite. They do their bidding. So, for example, they roll out this vaccine in the United States. It has, massive consequences for the population. Hundreds of millions of people take it. And no reporting on that vaccine, real reporting is allowed. I mean, people are literally fired from their jobs if they question the efficacy and the safety of that vaccine. I mean, that's insane. Mm-hmm. In a functioning democracy, the news media, if you had a mandatory drug where everyone's required to take it, their job would be to report out whether or not it's safe and whether or not it works. And they did just the opposite. Mm-hmm. And same in the war in Ukraine. I mean, this is potentially a nuclear conflict between superpowers. Mm-hmm. Shouldn't we know all that we can? No. Mm-hmm. You're not allowed. I tried to interview Vladimir Putin, and the U.S. government stopped me. Yeah. So think about that for a minute. Mm-hmm. And by the way, nobody defended me. There's not I don't think there was anybody else in the news media who said, wait a second, I may not like this guy, but he has a right to interview anyone he wants, and we have a right to hear what Putin says. Well, you're not allowed to hear Putin's voice because why? There was no vote on, no one asked me. I'm 54 years old. I paid my taxes and followed the law. I'm an American citizen. I'm a much more loyal American than, say, Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, who didn't even grow up in this country. She grew up in Canada. And they're telling me what it is to be a loyal American? Like, I'm just not even interested at this point. I don't even, I don't even care. When David Frum from Canada gets to tell me that I'm a disloyal American, it's a joke.
Yeah.
It's a joke. And I don't care what they think, actually, anymore. And I don't have to care, so I don't.
Just one such example of media manipulation is the media suppression and dismissal of Hunter Biden's laptop. You have studied the infamous laptop from hell. So did we. Since spring last year, we had a copy. We brought a series of articles here. You have profound knowledge about the Biden Business Network. You were the first to interview the Biden business insider Tony Bobulinski as early as in October 2020. From what you have seen, would you conclude that Joe Biden, I'm not talking about Hunter, I'm talking about Joe Biden, knew about his son's business, that he facilitated it, and that he might have profited himself?
Well, those aren't opinions. I mean, that's factually established. We interviewed Devin Archer last month, who on dozens of occasions at business meetings watched Joe Biden call his son Hunter during a business meeting. His son put him on speakerphone while Joe Biden was vice president of the United States in order to help his son's business. And by the way, the business, the so-called business, consisted wholly of being Joe Biden's son. I mean, Hunter Biden had no expertise in energy, knew nothing about Ukrainian gas. It's a joke. He didn't know, he had no relevant experience or knowledge of any of the so-called businesses he ran. He was purely selling access to his father. It's not speculation. That's what his business partner said on the record, on camera. So, there's no debate about that. That's a fact. And I mean, I guess the media hate Trump so much, or are profiting in some way, I suppose, from Joe Biden being president, that they feel they have to lie about it. But it's they're lying, period.
And still, there's no curiosity at all. Another story that has raised zero curiosity among the DC press is the allegation reportedly made by his own daughter Ashley in her private diary that Joe Biden may have behaved toward her in a way that she describes as, quote, probably not appropriate, end quote, when she was a young girl. Now, Hunter gave his dad the alias Pedo Peter in his cell phone contact list. I assume that in America, Pedo Peter is an unusual term of address for one's father. So why has the press shown so little interest in investigating these disturbing details, especially in the post-Me Too era?
Well, she said in her diary, whose only audience was herself, I mean, she didn't allege it, she recorded it, that her father took showers with her as a child, and because he did, she became a sex addict. So, I mean, that's what she wrote in her diary. And the response from the Biden administration was to get the Department of Justice to raid the home of the man who had the diary, arrest the people who had the diary, though they didn't steal it, they paid for it. Ashley Biden left it behind in a house she'd been renting. And they never said anything about it. I mean, that's a sex crime. I have 3 daughters. I can promise you. It's not normal for a father to shower with his daughters, especially when they're old enough to remember it. And she said in her diary, I think I have a sex addiction because my father showered with me. So, I mean, that's what she says. And I don't know why we're getting to the point where, and by the way, Joe Biden has dementia and is not running the United States. And so that raises the obvious question, who is? Who is?
What's your answer? Who is?
I mean, I would assume Barack Obama through his cutouts work for Joe Biden. But I don't know that. The New York Times hasn't bothered to report on it. But Joe Biden has dementia. He's not capable of speaking a complete sentence, much less running the largest organization in human history, which is the U.S. government. So the whole premise is ridiculous. And now they're telling us he's 80 years old He can barely speak. He can barely walk. And he's going to run again for president of the United States while there's a war going on? The whole thing is so demented that we're moving to the point where they're not trying to convince anybody. They're just trying to suppress and arrest people who ask questions. And they've arrested dozens of people, political opponents, not for committing crimes, but for opposing them in the past month. Dozens in the past month.
Now,
and so our system is collapsing in real time. We're watching this happen. And, you know, if you read the American media, stories about Kim Kardashian and lots of irrelevant crap about trannies and all this stuff, it's like none of it means anything. Look, the bottom line is the president of the United States is non-compos mentis. Who is running the government? If you can't answer that question, you're not doing your job in the media, it would seem to me.
Now, it looks like at this moment we don't know what's happening. You know, so many months to go to the next elections, but at the moment it looks like a rerun of what we had in 2020. Now, and you landed a great scoop with your interview with former U.S. President Donald Trump, which went on air just as the Republican candidates were holding their first debate on your previous channel, Fox. But I remember back in 2018, that's when we first met after Trump had been just in office, I think, for almost 2 years. You told me your assessment that at the juncture, quote, Trump is not capable as U.S. president. You named the border. He didn't, build the wall enough and stuff. If Trump succeeds in making a triumphant return in the White House, do you think he can be effective?
You know, of course, I don't know. I'd merely be speculating. I think it's pretty hard to, and I think his first term as president proved it's pretty hard to run an organization of millions of people, and most of them are paid to oppose you, which they are. I mean, they're unionized federal employees whose jobs depend on the other party. So the system itself is pretty difficult for someone who seeks to reform the system. At this point, however, they're trying to put Trump in prison for the crime of running against Joe Biden. So that's kind of all. I'm just speaking in my capacity as a voter. That's sort of all I need to know. Do I think if Trump were to take over tomorrow that he would make the CIA accountable to voters? No, I don't. Do I think he'd build a wall? I don't know. I hope so. But I know that you absolutely cannot allow a political party to use our system of justice to imprison the president's chief opponent. You can't do that. That's just absolutely not allowed. And so, so from my perspective, that's kind of what this election's about. Are we going to allow that or aren't we? And I just don't think we can.
Now, you mentioned that your fellow journalists can't stop criticize you. They call you you're reporting as pro-Russian or whatever. You recently took a lot of heat for your Larry Sinclair interview. Well, it's true that his claims were never pursued by an Obama-besotted press. Are you concerned that the one-on-one interview format of your online show limits your ability to fully investigate the truth of your guests' claims of fact?
Well, sure, of course. I mean, I've been doing one-on-one interviews on television for 25 years.
But you had a team at the time.
I have the same team.
Okay.
Yeah, I have exactly the same team. In fact, they're coming over for dinner in just a minute.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I think Larry Sinclair has been attacked. He was arrested at one point. He was dismissed as non-credible. And this has been going on for, 15 years. People have been attacking Larry Sinclair or dismissing him. And my view was, I'm the balance. Why don't we get to hear from Larry Sinclair? Okay, here's Larry Sinclair. You can make up your own mind as to what you think about it.
Right.
I mean, in other words, like liars, proven liars, like Ben Smith at Politico at the time, were able to get out there and tell us that everything Larry Sinclair said was false. Okay, that's Ben Smith's position. Here's Larry Sinclair's position. I mean, that's seems like I'm the balance as far as I'm concerned.
Some people say, is airing Larry Sinclair's personal recollections any different from Christy Blasey Ford's accusations against Brett Kavanaugh? I mean, this is the critique you get.
Well, it's very different. Larry Sinclair, I think it's different in its particulars, very different. But I also think, Larry Sinclair has a right to. Larry Sinclair, in my view, in a very credible way, said he had sex with Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. Now, since we're all so fanatically pro-gay now, we love everything gay is good. Why is that bad? Obama likes dudes. Why is that an attack on Obama?
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, am I the only non-homophobe here? It seems obvious to me that Obama likes dudes. He told his girlfriend that. Mm-hmm. Alex McNear, who's a distant cousin of mine, by the way. And he said, I fantasize about having sex with men. I guess it's a little strange to think that saying that out loud is somehow an attack. I don't know why it would be. I thought we're supposed to like dudes. I can't keep up.
No, Tucker, you've made a remarkable journey, and I really honestly say that in great admiration. Over the years, you've changed your mind about big issues, important issues like the invasion of Iraq.
Oh, yeah.
You went public, and very few journalists are willing to admit to a typo, let alone make a serious course correction. Is there an issue right now that you're reconsidering, taking a second look at, a previously held position that is currently under your review? Like the war in Iraq.
I changed my mind. Like every issue, I'm constantly changing my mind about things. Constantly. And, there are a lot of issues that I'm not sure I fully understand. AI, for example. I'm very worried that AI is going to destroy the world and become autonomous. But will it? I don't know. I guess I don't, other than like a gut level concern, I don't have I don't have a very smart view of AI. There are lots of issues like that I'm trying to figure out. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, I don't have to have an opinion on everything. I'm old enough that I'm happy to admit when I don't know the answer to something. But I'll tell you this, my view that the war in Ukraine imperils Western civilization, that's gotten stronger with time, not weaker. I feel that way. I thought that before, and now I really think it. Mm-hmm. There are lots of things I have worried about in the past that turned out to be not worth worrying about. One of them was, 20 years ago, I was just in the Middle East yesterday, and I was thinking, I first went to the Gulf in 2001, right after 9/11, and I was completely convinced that we were looking at the beginning of like a 500-year war against Islam, the West versus Islam. And that's not the way it turned out at all, actually. The Gulf Arabs that I have dealt with over the years are far more tolerant than your average, white secular liberal in America. Far more tolerant. They have a bigger and more Christian Christmas celebration in Abu Dhabi than they have in New York.
Now that is a bit of hope at the end of the interview. Just in general, what gives you hope looking into the future?
The stakes have suddenly gotten so high that smart people are rethinking their assumptions. And I see it all around me. I see people all around me asking themselves, I used to believe this. Is it still true? Was it ever true? What is the truth? People are focused on questions of truth and falsehood, I think, much more deeply than they ever have been. And that's a good thing. And I also see an awakening of spiritual awareness and religious faith in the United States that I think is great. Not everyone is reaching the same conclusions that I'm reaching, but that's okay. It's better than thinking that, Amazon's going to make you happy. Because Amazon is not going to make you happy, actually. That's not true. That's a lie. And more and more people seem to be concluding that it's a lie, and I think that's a great thing.
Yeah.
There's this idea that somehow, the main threat to our happiness is from religious people. That's absurd. The main threat to our happiness is from people who think they're God. They're the dangerous ones. If you think you're God, there's no limit to what you'll do.
Mm-hmm.
Because you think you're the final arbiter, you're the final judge, you're all powerful. That's terrifying.
Indeed.
You know what I mean? So,
sure.
I don't know. I'm much more comfortable around religious people, and I'm a Christian, but they don't have to share my views. As I just said, I was actually meeting with some people the other day, and there was a call to prayer right in the middle of our meeting, and everyone got up and got on their knees and faced toward Mecca and worshipped Allah.
Mm-hmm.
And 20 years ago, I would have thought, oh my gosh, how threatening. Now I thought, how wonderful. How great is that?
Tucker, when are you coming to Switzerland? I know it's boring. You told me there's nothing to report of, but it'd be nice to have you over here.
I love that. I love a boring country. You've got the last boring country in the West.
It's changing here too. It changes everywhere. It doesn't stop at the borders, but it's probably the political.
Yeah, no, it's true, but at least it's beautiful. I mean, if you have awe-inspiring physical beauty, at least you have something. I mean, it's kind of hard to take the mountains away. And I hope the second the American empire collapses, you get your banking secrecy back. Secrecy does not imply wrongdoing. Privacy is a prerequisite for freedom.